What did you say about my Lucy? He growled. Bleedin' useless, laughed Mrs. Lovett bitterly. Silly girl. Sweeney roared and pulled her up from the sofa by her wrist. You stupid bloody woman, he yelled. You hardly knew Lucy. You're just jealous of her because she's prettier than you'll ever be. Where the hell did that come from? He threw the woman onto the floor, roughly, and turned away from her, shaking with anger. It's not why I'm jealous of her, whispered Mrs. Lovett mournfully, wiping a smear of blood from her lip where she had bitten in the fall. I love you, Mr. Todd. He rounded on her, looking frankly infuriated. I don't care. You're not Lucy. You're not my Lucy. I'll never love you. He screamed at her. He darted towards her and grabbed onto her hair, yanking smartly upward. The hard day had taken its toll on him, and he lost all grip of reality. Mrs. Lovett's comments had just pushed him over the edge. No. It wasn't her comments that pushed him over the edge. It was her saying that she loved him that pushed him over the edge. Serious issues, this guy. Mrs. Lovett gave a sharp gasp of pain and struggled to get to her feet as Sweeney dragged her towards the mirror on the opposite side of the room. Pulling her roughly into a standing position, he grabbed the hair on the back of her head and forced her to look at her reflection. Tears were streaming down her face and red hairs were clinging to her shoulders from where they'd been ripped out. Look at yourself, snarled Sweeney. What color's your hair? Mrs. Lovett whimpered and said nothing. Anger bubbled over inside Sweeney. He put his face menacingly close to hers. Yeah, he pushed it. What color? Okay. To the Bakers. Did you fucking hear me? What color is your fucking hair, you stupid bitch? Can't you tell yourself, Sweeney? Or are you colorblind? Red, Mrs. Lovett gasped out as he gave her hair a particularly violent twist. Well done, he growled sarcastically. What color was Lucy's? What color? He demanded again to Mrs. Lovett's stricken face. Yellow. Lucy's hair was yellow, cried Mrs. Lovett as he pulled hard on the downy hairs at the bottom of the back of her head. That's right, it was fucking yellow. So I don't think I'll ever fucking love you. You're not fucking Lucy. So is he indicating that he only loved Lucy because she has yellow hair? Which, with each cruel word, he ripped her head backwards and slammed it full force into the mirror. She screamed and sobbed hysterically, begging him to stop, feeling shards of glass slicing into her face, feeling something warm and wet trickling down her face. He pulled her head back a final time and threw her back down on the ground. She landed awkwardly, spraining her wrist painfully, but she made no more sound as Sweeney stood over her and began to kick. Again and again his boot thudded into the woman curled on the floor, and she silently prayed for death. She lied still and waited for it to end. Sweeney must have felt she had had enough of this after a few minutes because he stopped kicking her. Instead, he knelt down next to her and swept her hair away from her bloody forehead. He turned her over and watched her wince and twitch as her tears trickled down into the bleeding cuts on her face. Do you still want to be Lucy, Mrs. Lovett? Do you still want to be my wife? He asked, almost gently. She stirred and let her eyes flicker open, looking at him in confusion. Do you still want to be my wife? Sweeney questioned her again, less politely. She frowned and still stayed quiet. He suddenly turned vicious again. Wow, what a shock. Tired of her defiance, he slapped her hard across the face, making all of her cuts smart horribly. Okay, why can't you just use the word sting? Making all of her cuts sting horribly. That sounds a lot better than smart. Are there dumb cuts too? She whimpered and stared up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Answer me now. I still love you, Mr. Todd, she murmured, nodding slowly. Why? Wrong answer. Bitch, what's wrong with you? Seriously, yelled Sweeney, pulling her to her feet again by her sore wrists. She squeaked in pain and fright as he pulled her around to face him. Wait a minute. If he was, lifting her up by grabbing her by the wrists, she'd have to be facing him to begin with. Unless, she has her arms on backwards. I mean, seriously. I don't know, stupid. He pulled her close to him, raking his fingernails hard along her scalp. With his other hand, he directed Mrs. Lovett up against the wall. She stood trembling, unsure of what was going to happen next, knowing she wouldn't like it, knowing it would hurt. She was right. With one hand, Sweeney was still clawing at the woman's head. The other, he snaked up under her skirts and forced down into her knickers, roughly kneading the hot flesh there. Is this what you want, Mrs. Lovett? He growled at her. Is this what you want from me? You want me to love you back? He shook her roughly and pinched the slick nub beneath his fingers. You want me to fuck you? Mrs. Lovett stood terrified, wanting him to stop touching her, to go away, but he wasn't finished yet, it seemed. I've told you about fucking ignoring me, Mrs. Lovett, he said threateningly. Haven't you learned your lesson yet, you stupid whore? He kissed her roughly, forcing his tongue so far into her mouth that she gagged on it, pulling his hand out of her hair, and jamming it down the front of her dress, sharply pinching her nipples. She cried out in pain as she felt his fingernails grip on her skin, leaving tiny half-moon indentations on her breasts. Gee, for a man that supposedly doesn't love this woman, he seems to like groping her, kissing her, and touching her boobs. No, Mr. Todd, she spluttered through tears. I don't want this. Are you sure? Mocked Sweeney, grinning evilly. Mrs. Lovett nodded frantically, but he ignored her and thrust a finger up inside of her. She shrieked in pain. He had taken off that ring, the spiky one. Ooh. She gripped on his shoulders to try to stop herself from losing her balance, but he slapped her away. Don't fucking touch me, you dirty little slut. Do you like this? He shoved another finger roughly up inside of her, and she cried out again, unable to stop herself. The pain was so intense. She felt as though she were being ripped in two. He sensed this, and added a third finger, and then a fourth. Mrs. Lovett cried and screamed, begging him to stop, but he had her pinned against the wall, and he wasn't about to let her go. When he got bored of this new torture, he pulled his fingers out of her. There was blood all over his ring and all over his fingers, as far up as they met his hands. Ugh, dirty bitch, look what you did to my hand. Got all fucking messy. He held up his hand to show her, and she swallowed, praying for it to end. What would she have to do now? Open your mouth, Sweeney snarled. She shook her head. Why she did it, she'll never know. Maybe she was tired of his games. She had enough. She was feeling brave. Either way, it was a bad idea. Did you just fucking tell me no? Hissed Sweeney. Mrs. Lovett shook her head rapidly, shaking. Open your fucking mouth. Mrs. Lovett did, and cringed as the taste of her own blood and vaginal fluids hit her tongue. She gagged instinctively from the taste, and from Sweeney's fingers forcing themselves to the back of her throat. He pulled his fingers out of her mouth just in time for her to vomit all over his pinstripe trousers. She shook and gasped as the blood and contents of her stomach fell from her mouth. Sweeney watched calmly, staring at his soiled trousers. When Mrs. Lovett eventually straightened up, Sweeney was staring at her coldly. You'll regret that, he said meanly. She tried to edge away, but he grabbed her collar and pulled her towards him. I will never love you, Mrs. Lovett, he whispered to her. You're a little whore, and I'll be glad when you're dead. Mrs. Lovett's eyes widened, and she began to struggle. Don't let him mean. With a flash of silver, Sweeney whipped a razor from a holster hooked onto his belt. Try saying that 10 times fast. He held it right up to her eyes and dragged it slowly just beneath her right eye socket to her chin. A shiny stream of blood began to drip down her face as she cried with fear, the salty tears making it sting unbearably. Sweeney calmly pulled the razor down on the opposite side of her face. The effect was a gruesome, tearful look, and Mrs. Lovett wiggled. Terrified, as Sweeney held the razor up to her throat, she pressed her head back, trying to edge away from the blade, exposing her neck even more. Sweeney smiled. Darling, you look so sad. Why are you crying? Don't cry. I love you. He laughed loudly and ran his fingers over the wound with his free hand. She flinched. Sweeney lowered the razor so that it rested on her breasts. He shot her an evil look, and then began to saw. Okay. When I decided to read this fanfic, I thought I was supposed to be reading a Sweeney Todd fanfic. Not a frickin' Saw fanfic!